That is why I begin the book with the Surah Nur, about enlightened thought. I think it's really important to recognize so in my view, enlightened thinking is a choice. I think it's a question of who wants to do that. In order to really master your own tradition, you do need fluency and accessibility to the languages in which that tradition is constructed. So Muslims were cut off, and they only read English work. Rather than look at what the content is, we've been more concerned with categorization, which is very much a colonial project of control. I show in the book how Muslims, certainly from the late 19th and early 20th century, writing in northern India, mainly in Urdu, which is what I used, were not only very open to the ideas that they were being introduced to under the colonial regime, but also because they were seen as not fitting the liberal or so-called liberalism of the empire, used terms that already existed in their own tradition, i.e. Roshan Khayali, which is literally enlightened thought. And this is surprising because so many words from English were incorporated into Urdu, but the word liberalism doesn't find a resonance in Urdu. Most of the writings that I use I deploy words like Wusat Damaghi, Azad Khayali, Roshan Khayali, and I'm sure the same is true in Bangla as well. So I thought it would be important. I mean, and most of the work, I mean, the other irritation I have is that, we focus on theologians, we focus on jurists, but not on the philosophy, poetry, literature sufficiently. It's not deemed to be Islamic enough by certain scholars. So that was something I wanted to challenge. And the other thing I'm really sort of questioning is, why are Muslims deemed to be unenlightened? And I find evidence to the contrary. It is true that in the 20th century and the post-colonial period, there has been a tendency to sort of confine free thinking, largely under authoritarian regimes. But that's not because of religion or because of anything inherent about being Muslim. It has to do with politics. It has to do with authoritarian regimes, which I might add the so-called West has actively supported and nurtured. And yes, so there has been a closing of the mind, if you like, but that has nothing to do with centuries of Muslim engagement with enlightened thinking.
Why do you think the intellectual tradition of Roshan Khayali has been marginalized in mainstream historical narratives?
Exactly. For one reason is that people don't read the texts carefully. They have preferred, under British influence, British colonial influence, to categorize Muslim thought as either classical, traditional, fundamentalist, or modernist. So I think that we've been circling around rather than look at what the content is, we've been more concerned with categorization, which is very much a colonial project of control. Of management. But I think Muslims have always engaged in Roshan Khayali. I have come across many works that specifically speak of Roshan Khayali and even are entitled as Roshan Khayal. And I think that despite military rule, certainly in this country that I'm based in right now in Pakistan, people have continued to produce works that are Roshan Khayal, that are not only engaged with new ideas from the West, but are also drawing on their own tradition. Another reason you could say that there has been a setback in this strand is that Muslims became more reactive under colonial rule, from what I describe as a self-confident modernity of an emperor like Akbar. Who was he was a modernist in his own way. To say that modernity is a US is a Western construct, it was brought to South Asia. I think I challenge that. I'm challenging that. There is evidence of Akbar's modernity, but that was a self-confident modernity, whereas in the colonial period, it became a defensive modernity, a much more defensive, trying to sort of offset the charges that the colonial state imposed or officials of the colonial state turned historians in their depiction of Muslims. I mean, you only have to look at your own region to see the Roshan Khayal open-mindedness that existed. I mean, Bengalis have always taken the lead intellectually. So I think that there is a need for us to do more work in that direction to really sort of also introduce our younger generation to those ideas, because by insisting that all of this has to be either theological or it has to be jurisprudential, you're turning them away from these things. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that the marginalization has nothing to do inherently with Islam, as Professor Bailey mistakenly believes or believed, and has more to do with the contextual situation. As we moved on, I mean, the fact of colonial subjugation, and then into a post-colonial scenario where, despite political decolonization, we never really managed to decolonize the mind. I don't think that many Muslims recognize this problem, certainly in Pakistan, and I think maybe in India, the extent to which we are still immersed in a colonial paradigm, and we haven't been able to move out of it. One great tragedy, of course, was that we lost our moorings in the Persian tradition because of the switch. And in order to really master your own tradition, you do need fluency and accessibility to the languages in which that tradition is constructed. So Muslims were cut off, and they only read English works. So I think there are a variety of factors which you could say have to do with material realities, political realities, rather than with what is inherently Islamic. I mean, there's nothing to prevent. I mean, that is why I begin the book with the Surah Nur about enlightened thought. I think it's really important to recognize that I mean, so in my view, enlightened thinking is a choice. I think it's a question of who wants to do that. If people want to do, I mean, I'm not suggesting that theological works and jurisprudential oriented works are not necessary, but I think we need greater variety to really understand the interpretive nature of the Muslim community.
Are there parallels between South Asian Roshan Khayali and other Muslim intellectual traditions
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, Iran. I mean, Iran is our closest, I mean, Turkey. So I do think that there is a lot. I mean, there was always, and I'll say this again, that, Roshan Khayali was intrinsically related to multilingual linguist people. Those who were multilingual, knew Arabic, Persian, and Urdu or Sanskrit, tended to be Roshan Khayal. But the problem with colonial, the colonial educational system that made us, I mean, I am myself an example of it. I accept that I was taught English. I write in English. But the thing is that we are sort of taken away from our own moorings, or we can't access them. And so, I mean, and with European writers that we think are authoritative, they themselves didn't have the linguistic skills to really do justice to Muslim writings. So you did have people like Iqbal who, look at the only intellectuals, the great intellectuals a country like Pakistan has produced are people like Iqbal, because and what was Iqbal? Iqbal was immersed in, his education, he was educated in Persian, Farsi. He wrote Farsi poetry as well as Urdu poetry. Amongst the poets, Faiz Ahmed Faiz. He was, the most progressive, one of the most progressive poets that Pakistan has produced, and whose songs are, whose poems are sung across the subcontinent and beyond, was also educated in Persian. So that has really made it impossible for us to access our own cultural traditions. That, I think, is the cause of the lack of confidence that you find in the Muslim youth of today. So, it's a kind of alienation that has been compounded by the policies of the post-colonial elite, who have found it convenient, after fighting the colonial state, to perpetuate the structures and ideas of the colonial state. So so that's what I ultimately mean, that through a process of decolonization, we need to understand what was, and we also have the ability to say no. I'm not saying that that for science you should go and read a Muslim scholar in the 7th century or 10th century. Knowledge is cumulative. It sort of accumulates over the years. But the racialization of knowledge, which the proponents and doyens of the West suggest, I think is a fabrication.